You can now support Ghost Maps on Patreon. Simply look for We Are HANTU or click the link in the description. Inspired by an account from Winnie. Ghost Maps, entry 119, Lower Albert Road, Hong Kong. I'm not the first collector of ghost stories. I had thought, however, that being a collector simply meant that I had the one great responsibility: to collect ghost stories from people all around our region. To keep those stories alive. As it turns out, there's at least one more responsibility that I hadn't been aware of. My third eye had recently opened. When it did, I was visited by a multi-generational family of spirits. Those spirits had informed me that some of my predecessors had the third eye too, and that they had an agreement to meet on an evening during the Hungry Ghost Month every year and collect their stories. I've decided that I need some answers. I recently met with Father Aloysius, a mutual friend of mine and my direct predecessor. He tells me that my predecessor did not possess the third eye as far as he knew, but the collector before him did. I won't reveal my direct predecessor's name just yet. He still has living relatives, and names hold power. If I revealed his name, I would put those relatives in danger. Malicious spirits might come for them. After all, this job certainly has its fair share of dangers. His predecessor, however, doesn't have any living relatives anymore. His name was Krishna. We called him Krish for short, says Ben, a friend of my predecessor's. Ben wasn't really involved in what we do, though he has shared with me a story before. And now he has another one. As with Father Aloysius, I figure it's worth killing two birds with one stone. I can learn more about my predecessors, and I can add another story to my collection. And just like with Father Aloysius, we start with his story first. Our drinks arrive at this coffee shop along Jalan Kayu, and I switch on my recorder. Let me guess, he says with a smile. You want me to start from the beginning? I simply smile and nod. Ben's niece, Rachel, had been living in Hong Kong since the late 90s. She had initially moved for work, but while living there, met a young man named William. It was love at first sight for the pair, and they were married within a year. By March 2002, just 3 months after they were married, she was already expecting their first child. The pregnancy, thank heavens, went off without a hitch, Ben tells me. I was visiting them that year, and she was the happiest pregnant woman I've ever met, he adds with a chuckle. While the pregnancy didn't cause her any trouble, her stay at the hospital proved to be another story altogether. Her water broke in the midst of a heavy thunderstorm on a Thursday evening while she was at the office. The baby was a few weeks earlier than she had expected, but William was prepared. He raced down to her office as quickly as the rain-slicked roads would allow. He picked her up, then sped to the Hong Kong Central Hospital, down on Lower Albert Road. When they arrived, however, it took the staff an hour and a half to find a bed for her for some reason. From what Rachel told me later, it wasn't even particularly hectic, Ben tells me. The systems seemed to be acting up, but only for her. She was given a bed eventually, in a ward with 5 other expecting mothers. By that time, however, it was already close to 9 p.m. Rachel didn't think she was going to get any sleep, but she tried to, at least, rest after her frantic evening. William headed down to get some coffee from the cafeteria, leaving her with a couple of minutes to settle down. With the pillow in the right position and the blanket covering just enough of her legs, Rachel closed her eyes. Despite all that had happened, she found herself dozing off and soon falling into a restful slumber. But she was suddenly brought back to the waking world when she felt sharp, jagged nails press against her calves. Her eyes shot back open as she scrambled up the bed. She looked around her. The other mothers were either asleep or speaking with their husbands. Where was William? Rachel had begun to wonder. She looked at her watch to see that barely a minute had passed. That didn't feel right to her. She had to have been asleep for longer than that, surely. 15 minutes at least. After a while, her eyelids grew heavy again. Just as sleep took over though, she felt the nails once more, and this time they dug into her skin, which would have been terrifying enough, but this assault was accompanied by a vicious hiss. A shrill voice dripping with wickedness. Give me your legs, Rachel screamed. All the other mothers turned towards her in shock. None of them seemed to hear the voice. None of them seemed to see the pair of arms that crept back under the bed. At this point, William returned, rushing into the ward after hearing his wife's shriek. She begged him, pleaded with him to get her another bed. He hesitated at first, trying to placate her, reassuring her that she was just tired, that she imagined the whole thing. As exhausted as she was, though, Rachel was absolutely sure of what she had heard and felt. And she had the wounds on her calves to prove it. She stopped pleading and started insisting. William relented. It took them 3 hours to get a new bed. William and Rachel had to argue with the hospital staff over and over. Until another bed was ready, Rachel sat stubbornly in a wheelchair instead. She was in a foul mood, the pain from her own contractions exacerbating the discomfort of sitting in the chair. But it was heaven compared to the alternative. Finally, she was given a new bed. 15 minutes later, she was taken to the delivery room, and by midnight, her daughter was born. The child was safe, Ben tells me. But Rachel was a bit of an overprotective mother for those first few years. Ben says that he can't blame her. She had no idea why that thing targeted her. She didn't know if it was after her or her child, no matter what it hissed at her. And she didn't know if it followed her home. I didn't want to mention anything to Rachel at the time, but that hospital had a grim reputation, Ben says. He tells me that this is all hearsay, stories he heard from other friends he had in Hong Kong. Because of its dark history, I've heard stories that creatures had grown within its walls over time, he says. Creatures that feed on the souls of babies. He says that he doesn't know if one of these creatures terrorized Rachel. Thankfully, in the end, it didn't matter. As the years went on, Rachel grew to embrace motherhood, finding the joy in it, despite her fears. That baby girl, Ben says, with a smile. She's studying to be a gynecologist now. I asked Ben about Krish, specifically about whether he had the third eye. He did, Ben says, which shocked your predecessor. He was such a jovial fella, Krish. You never would have been able to tell that he carried that weight with him. I asked if Krish had said anything about his third eye and what it meant in the greater scheme of things as a collector. Ben shook his head. He didn't say anything to your predecessor, at least. I think Krish didn't want him to know, especially if he didn't have the third eye himself. I asked Ben how he knew that Krish had the third eye then. He told another collector, someone who does have that gift. Ben says, you know her actually. I ask him who it is, and he tells me. You remember Alice, right? If you want to discover more of Southeast Asia's other side, subscribe now and follow us on social media. You can also be one of our supporters on Patreon. Look for We Are HANTU or click the links in the description. Ghost Maps is a HANTU production created by Kyle Ong and Wayne Ray, with art direction by Jolene Lim, and recorded on Audio Technica mics.